Now to our final speaker, sitting next to me in this session, Dr. Nina Reineke. She is head of science of Chemtrust. Chemtrust is a very dynamic and influential environmental NGO, and Dr. Reineke has been a regular guest at previous HBM conferences.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's really a special situation and a special pleasure to be in person here today. And I would also like to thank the organizers for really conducting this exercise of the hybrid conference. And it's a pleasure to be invited to this very nice location, which is actually a transformed church. So it ensures we're having a lot of space. We have followed the work as Chemtrust of human biomonitoring activities for over many years. And in particular, the European HBM4 project, we followed as a stakeholder organization since 2017. Lots of important work has been carried out, as we heard this morning, and there's a lot more to come. And today, in this session, I would like to share some general reflection on relevant issues to human biomonitoring studies wherever they are carried out. My first involvement with human biomonitoring was in 2005, when we tested the blood of European families as part of a campaign by WWF. It was a snapshot study, 3 generations from 12 families from European countries, grandmother, mother, child. And it showed clearly that general population is exposed to many harmful chemicals that were never designed to end up in people's bodies. So sometimes I wonder, what can I tell them today? Yes, some restrictions have fortunately been decided on. But overall, the concerns about the harmful properties of chemicals have increased. The knowledge about contributions to health impacts, as we already heard today, has increased. And still we're finding legacy chemicals in the general population, and increasingly and additionally chemicals that are used as replacements for those that have been restricted. This is not good news. Therefore, it's really important for all what we're discussing today. Human biomonitoring is not an early warning. If we're finding chemicals in people's bodies, the exposure has already taken place. So already the unborn child is exposed to harmful chemicals in the womb. And it's a result of a failed risk assessment in those cases when these exposures were not predicted, or a result of the failed risk management in those cases where the exposures were expected but not prevented. So we were dealing with nothing less than an unfair pollution burden for the current and future generation. This is why the human biomonitoring research that you do is so important, to check the effectiveness of regulation, to find where are the gaps, where we need to target more interventions, to address open policy questions where is regulation warranted, but also to identify the needs and the adaptation for assessment procedures so that in future they become better and more predictive. It's important to assess the combined body burden. Nothing illustrates this better than human biomonitoring, and to steer the further research on health impacts. But really the clear added value is to use the HBM results as a follow-up for regulatory measures to avoid future exposures and protect health. Once the chemicals are in people, it's too late for precaution. In all of this, it's important to remember that as good as we are with what we do with human biomonitoring studies, we're only monitoring a small percentage of the overall body burden of people. The HBM4 project just started a new round of new nominations for priority chemicals, and it's clear that there is many to focus on, potentially, so resources need to be chosen wisely, and at the same time keep in mind that it's just the tip of the iceberg. We would lose too much time if we ever tried to measure all of these. As one of the priority chemicals in the HBM4U project, it's also the group of PFAS, where we just heard very concerning data also from Japan and the US. So recent trend studies confirmed that fortunately levels of PFAS before decreased over the last 20 years, but they are still major contributors to the body burden. And studies from Germany, from kids, so adults and kids and teenagers between 3 and 17 years, have been shown that 20% are still above the HBM1 value, just for PFOA. In addition, there are short-chain PFAS used as a replacement. And as you know, the HBM1 value means that effects above means a level where effects cannot be excluded with sufficient certainty. So we really need a full GREEP restriction for PFAS to stop the regrettable substitution, but we also need a more frequent and more forward-looking HBM. If we didn't know the levels of PFAS in the 80s, which were really high, what are we missing today? Human biomonitoring also looks into developing guidance values, which is important for specific questions and to target policy interventions. But any guidance level needs to be used and communicated with extreme caution. It should not be misused or mistaken for a safe level. Because we have individual susceptibilities, we have vulnerable groups where we have to assume that exposure in periods of high vulnerability, so sensitive windows, we cannot exclude that serious and irreversible effects are triggered by these exposures to the chemicals. We also have combination effects, so there's a limited value of having an individual HBM guidance value for one chemical. And also, previously assumed safe levels are lowered over time. So these are living values. EFSA just lowered the tolerable daily intake for PFAS, based on the increased concern that the effects are starting already at lower concentrations. We have a new TDI value for 4 PFAS, and now the estimation is that EU citizens are exposed at levels that put them at risk. So this is really concerning and needs to be followed up by action. So in conclusion, results from previous HBM studies so far have already shown the need to prevent future exposures and protect health by stricter controls. And it's also important that policy action should not depend on the availability of HBM data. We should never make it prerequisite, because then we can only regulate too late. So a focus on restricting groups of substances for PFAS or bisphenols is important, as well as to address the reality of combined body burden, and avoiding the impression that we can ever have acceptable levels of harmful chemicals in people. So Europe needs a sustainable HBM system that builds on the achievement of HBM4U, and also a chemical strategy that protects current and future generations. For everyone involved in human biomonitoring studies, it's clear that the control and the control measures for regulating chemicals must be increased. Only then can we go back to the families and tell them that things are getting better and that the body burden of their children and grandchildren will actually be decreased eventually.